Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and my name is Gabriella. I'm a community engagement coordinator with Austin ISD. Just a couple housekeeping reminders. We will be sort of shifting the structure of this event. We had originally planned a panel style discussion followed by a Q&A, but we got a lot of questions, which is great. We're super happy to see the level of engagement that y'all have with this event. So we're going to be starting with some of the Q&A after we give our leaders a chance to introduce themselves. I will be pulling questions from the registration questions that you all filled out when you registered for this event. But if you have a question that you either didn't submit through that form or that you don't hear getting asked, please feel free to type that question in the chat as we are moving along. So I'm going to go ahead and let our leaders introduce themselves, starting with our superintendent, Dr. Elizalde.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. It is truly, of course, an honor for me to serve as your superintendent here in our capital city of Austin ISD.
Ms. Casas?
Good afternoon, everyone. Elizabeth Casas, Chief Academic Officer. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Dr. Mays?
Good evening, everyone. Anthony Mays, Chief of Schools. Glad to be here and a part of the conversation this evening.
Dr. Hawley?
Good evening, Stephanie Hawley, Equity Officer, and welcome to the conversation.
Mr. Brinkman? Do we have Mr. Brinkman with us? No, we might return to him. Chief Gonzalez? Also no chief. Ms. Stevens?
Leslie Stevens, Chief of Human Capital, welcome.
Dr. Reach?
Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Reach, and thank you for having us here tonight.
Ms. Wallace?
Hi, everyone. Michelle Wallace, the Executive Director of the Office of Innovation and Development, and great to be here.
Mr. Segura?
Hello, everyone. Matias Segura, Acting Chief of Operations. Excited for the conversation. Thank you.
And finally, Mr. Stanford.
Hi, Jason Stanford here. Pleasure to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So to start out, we saw a lot of questions in the registration and have, of course, heard a lot of questions over the past several weeks about what the end of the school year is going to look like as we wrap up the last few weeks, as well as what kind of structure we're going to have for next school year. So I'd like to start and have Dr. Mays briefly talk about how we're going to be wrapping up this school year.
Sure, I'll be happy to share that. And so this school year, we are excited to have something that closely mirrors what we would see in any normal circumstance. Due to COVID, we will be hosting our graduations outdoors. And unfortunately, we won't have a band. We'll be pouring in music. Those will take place from May 28th to June 3rd. We will have quite a few protocols in place to make sure that we are actually conducting our graduations safely. And so that includes social distancing, temperature checks, as well as students will only be able to bring 4 guests. That's graduation. We've also actually been conducting proms, and so we've been allowing students to be able to move through this rite of passage for seniors safely by making sure that they also social distance and that they are taking advantage of prepackaged foods, and they're also hosting those in indoor and outdoor venues so that we can make sure that we celebrate the end of the year with our seniors safely.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Mays. And Dr. Elizalde, if you could talk a little bit about next school year, specifically potential opportunities for hybrid or virtual learning, as well as things like Flex Fridays.
Sure. So thank you again so much. Maybe we can get some of the questions addressed through this particular section. For next year right now, and part of the challenges include the fact that the legislature is still in session. So there were actually two versions of a virtual bill, what we're calling a virtual bill, one in the House and one in the Senate. And currently, there's still disagreement about those two bills. By law, public ISDs in Texas have not been allowed to offer any type of virtual delivery of instruction. Obviously, we did this year due to the pandemic. Initially, the commissioner spoke to all of the superintendents maybe 6 weeks ago or so and indicated that we should be planning for the ability to offer virtual under certain circumstances, maybe a hybrid, maybe completely virtual. Unfortunately, since then, he has reversed course and said it will only be up to the legislature to decide whether we have the ability to offer that. So I want to start off with that. Our team will still be working to plan for some sort of a virtual in the event that we get approval to do so. We want to be able to have something that is already able to be rolled out. It will probably be offered to a very limited number, because one of the areas that we absolutely are committed to doing is to ensuring that teachers are not going to be doing concurrent instruction. We must have only one delivery option available for teachers to do. The idea of what the Texas Education Agency recommended and expected us to do with both a simultaneous or a concurrent delivery of Zoomers and Roomers, if you will, is not something that we know. Most importantly, it is not sustainable. Teachers cannot, many of you on this on this screen right now with me, that is not something that is sustainable. You all have done amazing work in trying to do the best you can, and we have to continue to recognize that that cannot be the delivery. So at this point, we are anticipating and planning for a much more traditional type of school environment. We now know that staff have had access to vaccinations, and that in addition to that, masking of students has worked, and the CDC continues to recognize that as a good practice. Whether we will or will not have masks will be dependent upon the CDC guidelines. At this point, it does not look like masks would be not something that we would be doing. I know I've already received some emails from some parents who may be on this call now, or who may be in the later call or the later Zoom meeting. At this point, the science that we will be following will be the CDC guidelines. And so if at that point for next year they recommend that we utilize masks, then we will be utilizing masks. We will be considering an option for outside during PE or during recess, as we have done with sports and those types of activities. We want to align those areas. But at this point, even though there may be some surrounding districts that may be going to optional masks for next school year, that is not something that I am comfortable with unless the CDC science guidelines recommended that. So we think the most important thing to do is to recognize that our teachers cannot be replaced. And so we will be following science guidelines with regard to best practices, as long as the CDC says those are the best practices to use for our staff.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Elizalde. Another topic that we received a lot of questions about was staffing. Obviously, we know that we've made some changes to the staffing formula, and there are a lot of questions about how that's going to affect programs. So Ms. Stevens, could you talk to us a little bit about what those changes to the staffing formula are and how they may or may not have affected programs or potentially caused cuts to programs?
Yes, I would be more than happy to. I'm going to just give a broad overview first of where we are as a district. So a year ago, in the spring of 2020, the district was projected to have 80,000 students. During this school year, our enrollment is right around hovering between 74 and 75,000 students. So we have a student enrollment difference between 5,000 and 6,000 students. So what that means is we staffed our schools for 80,000, but we only have 74 to 75,000 students currently enrolled. So that's, we're overstaffed for this school year. So moving into next school year, our projected student enrollment is 77,000. And while that's more than the current students we have, it still doesn't rise to the 80,000 students that we're currently staffed for. So when we looked at the staffing, the old staffing guidelines, we saw it from multiple perspectives and as an opportunity to reset the district in terms of where we put our resources. So as you all know, one of our core beliefs and founding principles is equity. And so we have heard a lot about, the need to have resources placed where we have our greatest needs. And so we looked at our guidelines and adjusted them to account for that. And just to kind of give a context, because I know one of the questions was, how are larger class sizes across the district beneficial? But I just kind of need to put that in perspective. So the old guideline at secondary was 29-1. And we actually reduced that to 28-1. And so within our guidelines, we did reduce at that level. We maintained the 6 out of 8 that has been in the formula. But one of the things that I guess I just want people to understand is, like, let's say a campus had 1,000 students, and out of the 1,000 students, 500 of those were economically disadvantaged identified. What we did was we waited for those students. So instead of using the 1,000 for enrollment, we used whatever the calculation came out to be. Let's say it was, 7, I'm trying to think what in my head really quickly what that would be, but we waited for the economically disadvantaged. So we actually took a larger number to calculate the number of FTEs for a campus than if we'd have gone just straight on the number for projected enrollment. And so what we basically do is we say, this gives you your bucket of teachers. And then from there, campuses do their choice sheets. They make their selections for the following year. Those are tallied up. And then master schedules are developed off of student choices. And so that's the secondary look at it. The hard part comes in when you're a secondary principal and you're looking at what students want and how do you create your master schedule. And you have to look at everything from what courses conflict to which ones are single offered one time, which ones are offered 2 times. What is my schedule like, block, straight, all of that. So all of that comes into play. And so that's at the secondary level. At the elementary level, we did do something a little different in that in the past, we always got a projected enrollment by grade level. And let's say it was 60 third graders. And we just divided 60 by 22, and that was the number of teachers you got. And then a principal was then left to figure out how many bilingual do they need, how many ESL, Gen Ed do they need. This year, we actually did the projection, and then we divided it out by program and then divided. So in a lot of cases, we already accounted for those programmatic changes at the elementary level by our initial formula. And so I am going to just go through some of the questions that were submitted, because that's just a big, broad overview of how it works. But it says, how do you respond to a disappointed student who won't be able to take classes that were cut as a result of new staffing changes? So I will say, and I've had 2 kids go through high school. There were years where they got their first choice of classes, and there were years where they didn't, regardless of the staffing ratio on the campuses, because there are times when if they selected just a singleton class, it might have conflicted with another class that they were enrolled in. There were times when there were so few students that the campus either stacked the class like a Latin 3 and Latin 4, or they just didn't offer one of them if there weren't enough students. So I don't know I don't know that is a new phenomena. That is, something that kids have dealt with every year in terms of scheduling. It said, what consideration did you give the special campus needs when making staffing? So after we did our initial round of staffing, any campuses that had extra needs or unique situations, we did work with those principals and identify what they needed. And in terms of that, we did work through those. Like LASA was one of those where we did work with the principal and we did identify, what were their special needs and made some adjustments.
To expand on that, sorry to interrupt, Ms. Stevens, I did see a question in the chat specifically about CTE, that's Career and Technical Education funding. And since that's closely related to that last question, can you address that?
Yes, so we gave the schools their bucket and let's say they got, 75 FTEs. Then based on what the school offers, let's say I have this career pathway and I need 2 teachers for that career pathway. They'll assign 2 teachers to that career pathway and that funding will then change to CTE funded. So that's how we're going to identify our CTE funded, is based on the pathways offered at a school. And so the other thing is I know one of the other questions was, what is your ideal student to teacher ratio? So there is not an ideal. I will say that because you have such a wide range of courses, especially at the secondary level, that you can't have an ideal. So we have legal limits in some grades like K through 4, but you have limits at secondary too in things like the CTE classes. So automotive classes may have a ratio of 15:1 just because of the equipment and the work they're doing, whereas Art 1 doesn't have that same limit. So the idea of dividing by a student to teacher ratio doesn't mean that every class is going to have the same number of students. Like that just is totally impossible. A PE class may have 50 to 60 students in a period, whereas I'm trying to think of a class off the top of my head. Biology, I may have 19 this period. Next period, I may have 30. Because all of that is just how your master schedule flows out. And so there's not an ideal one. And then I know a couple other questions that I'll try to get answered here. How are larger class sizes across the district best pedagogy for any student? So once again, 28:1 is a reduction of what had previously been used. But just as a former teacher, there are a multitude of instructional strategies that teachers employ in a classroom. And hats off, because I know that they do a lot of work, but when you have a group of 30 students, there's times where you pair them to work with a partner. There's times where you work with small groups. There's times where you work with large, whole groups. And so there's a lot of different instructional arrangements to meet the needs of the students in your classes that you're servicing. And so I don't know that there's like a magic or ideal number.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Stevens, for those answers to those questions. On a similar note, as we talk about funding, a question that we've received pretty frequently since last week it was announced that the state will be releasing the federal relief funds to school districts is, when can we expect to see those and what will we be doing with them? So if somebody would like to answer that question, please.
I think we have, can you hear me a little better? I was told I wasn't.
Yes.
Is that better? Okay, thank you. Appreciate the comment so that I can get to where everybody can hear me. Dr. Reach has been working on most of our governmental relations, and so has George Goganas. So I'll turn over to them in just a second. Just want to remind everyone that part of this is we still don't have the dollars, although they've now said that they've released them. And I know to all of you who've been doing this work for a long time, you recognize that's not new. in terms of how long it takes for us to get the dollars actually into the school district. The second thing, please keep in mind, these are one-time dollars only. And so, you know, as everyone knows with budget formulas, one-time funds cannot be used for positions and cannot be used for salary increases because those are recurring costs. So what happens at the end of 2 years, if you have enough money to fund salary increases, then 2 years from now, if there's no additional revenue, then you have to revert to changing salaries. So that's why if they even allow it, something like a one-time payout is sometimes some options we can afford during these kinds of times. The first thing we want to try to do is reimburse ourselves the deficit budget from last year, which was somewhere around 55 million for some of the COVID related expenses. But there are a whole bunch of rules that they are now attaching to what we can and cannot do with these funds. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Reach and maybe George, Mr. Goganas, to maybe clarify just what we know up to this point. And by the way, yesterday, we got a very new piece of information that said it's a possibility that if we are not aligned with the CDC guidelines on masking, we could jeopardize that funding.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. So the information that we do know is that AISD is eligible for up to $156 million through this CARES 3 set of funding. I think everyone knows, but it's worth mentioning, CARES 1, the first set of funding that came, was supplanted by the state. The state provided AISD $17 million, and then they reduced the amount of state aid that we received by $17 million, effectively meaning that they supplanted it. The CARES 2 funding has not yet been distributed or even shared on how much we would be eligible for. We believe it could be up to $76 million, but we're still waiting on that information because the state needs to, because of an issue with funding for higher education that's tied to CARES 2 funding, unrelated to the funding for school districts. But for CARES 3, we have 156 million. 2/3 of that funding can be drawn down once we have submitted an application to the state. So this will be done as a formula grant similar to title funds, but we do have to submit a plan to the state that signifies some certain things. One, that we will be offering, that schools will be open. Two, that we have done community outreach, both to our community, our staff, our students, our families, on how these funds can be utilized. And then 3, we need to actually turn in that plan and post the plan on our website. So we do hope to have some information and to start utilizing these funds as early as this summer, but certainly for next year in a way that can supplant a lot of the great work that we're already doing. And we look forward to finding some of the ways that we will utilize those funds. What we know is that there are 15 allowable uses for these funds. And I'm not going to name all 15, but at a very high level, they are focused around facility improvements for instance, for HVAC or for windows or for air circulation, things like that. PPE, technology, and then what the federal government called addressing learning loss. And so that's anything that we do that can address accelerated learning or what they're calling learning loss. So that could be additional enrichment activities before or after school during the summer. It could be additional supports during the school year. It can also be mental health supports and counseling supports for families. So those will all be things that we'll be asking for feedback on so that we're ensuring that we're utilizing these funds to best improve student outcomes.
Thank you so much, Drs. Reach and Elizalde. Next, because of course we have LASA and our special campuses represented on this call, I'd like for us to address some of the questions you had that were a bit more specific to magnet programming. So if somebody would like to address broadly what vision do we have for magnet programs, what role do we imagine that they'll be playing, and how do we plan to support our magnet programs going forward?
Well, I think there's no doubt that our magnet programs are a huge component of many parents who choose to come to Austin ISD, as well as some additional programs. But I mean, there's no hesitation on supporting the excellence that occur in our magnet programs whatsoever. I hope I'm getting the number right. If I read, LASA was number 4 in that top 100 list across the nation. Did I get that right, Principal Crescenzi? Okay. And so, I mean, clearly, whether we're talking about, you know, any of our magnet programs, they offer a state-of-the-art approach to meet the needs of students who have areas of interest that align with what parents would like them to do. And so I think we will continue to support the magnet programs. Some of the questions I'm asking are about access to magnet programs and about whether there should be a consideration for even expansion of some of our magnet programs. If there's some things that are going so well, then maybe there should be a need for replication of some of these outstanding programs. And so if anything, as we continue to work towards dealing with COVID, with the loss initially of some student enrollment, how do we ensure that we have access to all parts of our community to have quality magnet programs? And I think we've already done some of that, and I'd like to see us build on that. I don't know if there are any additional curricular or school leadership pieces that either Ms. Casas or Dr. Mays would like to add to that.
Other than we're here to support the schools to meet the high expectations of our community, we're ready and willing and able to do whatever we need to help our principals make sure that they're meeting the needs of their schools.
You know, I do want to add one other thing that we have been in conversation with as we are continuing to examine our practices and learn from best practices, certainly across our own district as well as throughout the state and the nation, is the fact that our elementary campuses do not have a specific magnet component. Rather, our teachers that are selected to choose students that have, and by that I shouldn't say magnet, I should say gifted and talented.
Yeah.
And the gifted and talented, so let me restate that. I got magnet intertwined with what was actually in my head was gifted and talented. So our teachers at elementary are having to continue to maintain their gifted and talented credentialing to serve gifted and talented students at our elementary schools. Another way to continue to strengthen gifted and talented and build upon having excellent schools, whether they're comprehensive and or magnet, is to ensure that those students are also receiving that particular extension. And so we will be looking into how we can continue to support the expansion of gifted and talented at all of our schools, but we know that that definitely starts at the elementary level.
Great, thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, starting with, similarly, as you just elaborated for the vision for magnet programs, it would be great if somebody could speak a little bit to the vision for our alternative and juvenile justice campuses. Sure.
Again, Dr. Elizalde just touched on what we want to do for our magnet schools. Similarly, we will want to be able to meet the needs of those students placed in those situations also. We want to give them a high quality experience, educational experience as they go through those classrooms, but we also recognize the social and emotional component that we need to be able to address within those students. And so as we go back and revisit some of the practices that we have in place now, we want to make sure that we provide resources that support students that have various challenges. We know a lot of the situations that lead to students being placed into those situations are connected to drug use. And so how are we providing the counseling needed for those students? How are we making sure that as those students transition back to the campus, that they continue to get the support pieces that we put in place for them at the alternative school? Trying to make sure that as we think about those students, we think about the whole child, and we provide for the needs for a number of different experiences that students bring into that situation. So whether it's psychological trauma or anything else like that, when that student is placed on that campus, how can we make sure we're meeting those student needs?
And let me add one more component, because while we haven't completely finished the process, as we've been working and studying the data with Principal Jones, who also, thank you, Principal Jones, for also being here. We recognize that there are, these are those kinds of conversations that also require a lot of thought, because the type of approach of these types of behaviors deserve this kind of outcome, and that means that that's how we have, you know, strict schools, that everything is in order, can also create at the very same time a disproportionate of representation of students, which is something that we do have in our district. We have over-representation of several student groups. Of course, one in particular are African-American males. And we've also seen multi-year assignments to Alternative Learning Center. And that is not a good practice. And so that's one of the areas that we will be moving and making some changes on. The specificity of some of those changes are still being finalized, but I do want everyone to know the direction in which we're heading. We need to continue to focus on why behaviors occur, not the reaction of these are the punishments for those behaviors. And so instead of asking ourselves, you know, discipline is something we do to students, discipline should be something we do for them. And so that's going to require the types of resources and supports for the students, which really goes back to our definition of equity, which includes that we are meeting students' needs so that they can be their best. And that's going to require us to rethink some of the ways in which we've been utilizing our Alternative Learning Center.
Great, thank you. So that's an excellent segue into the portion about equity. But before we jump into that, real quickly, if somebody could answer this question from the chat, will gifted and talented program offerings be open to students digitally or exclusively in person?
I won't be able to answer that because I don't know what we have available in terms of what is going to be available virtually at this time.
Totally understand. So moving into our portion about equity, we received a couple of questions that I think are just fantastic questions that I'd love for us to kind of dig into, starting with how will the recently hired leadership team, those of you who are on the call with us right now, learn about the history and the story of our campuses and our school district prior to making decisions that will impact students?
Well, I think
Hello? Go ahead, Dr. Elizalde, go ahead.
I think we started learning about those issues immediately as we started to meet with a variety of stakeholders. I also think that as we continue to learn about the entire district is as important as learning about each individual campus as well. There's absolutely a 100% direct correlation to understanding the context in moving into decision making. And then there are also some decisions that we are looking at that impact the entire district because of certain circumstances. And right now I'm specifically talking about where we are with regard to our budget, the fact that last year was a $55 million budget deficit. We had to use fund balance to complete this school year. And we are still at the point where where we are still expending more dollars than what we are taking in. And so with a reduction in student enrollment, some of these issues are really almost faced with not a lot of areas of which there's a long runway to be able to really explore a variety of options. On the other hand, I think the question is absolutely centered around the more we know about the context and the understanding, the better we make decisions. And we'll continue to work towards ensuring that we understand the history of not just our schools, but also of our entire Austin community knowing that there's quite a bit of history that has affected some of the underrepresentation in some positive areas for some of our student groups and an overrepresentation in some areas that we wouldn't want to see overrepresentation of some of our student groups.
Great, thank you. And I know that one of the things that you learned in response to the work that you've been doing so far to learn more about our district and our campus is the need for an equity advisory committee, which I would love for Dr. Hawley to explain to our participants.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to be in the conversation today. We have just formed an equity advisory committee. We have had our second meeting, and it's designed to help us rebuild some relationships in our community and to make sure we're getting direct feedback from caregivers and community organizations and students. And right now we have a growing number of students who have signed up to be on the various subcommittees. If you look to the right of the screen, you'll see the subcommittees. And some of our students are really wanting to get involved and have already met to talk about student well-being and achievement. But as you look at the various subcommittees, that's where we invite all of you who are with us this evening. If you're interested, I'll drop the link in the chat so that you can learn more about the committee. And when our meetings are held, we'll have the next meeting on June 1st at 5:30. And hope we can get as much engagement from our staff as possible, because the idea is that we are, again, rebuilding relationships, and we want to make those opportunities for connections. We have a little bit of a different model for our committee. We have two co-chairs who are from the community, and we have two co-chairs who are AISD staff. And the idea is that they will come together and make recommendations for Dr. Elizalde with regard to those things that we don't always see as a district. Sometimes we're running really fast and we don't see the things on the margins. We don't see issues. And our hope is that our community and our staff will bring equity issues to our attention and bring some solutions as well. Dr. Elizalde, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, ma'am, I think you covered it. Thank you. I just do like to refer to that as that flower petal blooming, that we have to continue to go back and recognize, even when the work is hard, because it changes the way in which we may be doing our practices. It is necessary for us to continue to struggle through that so that we can come and be better educators and continue to serve our community.
Thank you so much. I just saw a question in the chat about the equity plan, which is something that has been in the works for some time now, and when we expect that to be released and published.
So the equity plan was completed in February. And Dr. Elizalde, did you want to talk a little bit about its release and its function? I think Michelle Wallace is probably going to talk tonight about the function of the equity plan. And I would turn it over to Dr. Elizalde about the release.
Maybe before we do that, you can describe how we've intertwined that so that they actually recognize that there aren't separate plans per se, Dr. Hawley.
Absolutely. And so we started the equity plan back in fall 2019 and talked to well over 1,500 folks. And some of you who are actually on this call contributed. We went and we asked, what are the district's strengths with equity? What are our challenges? What are the solutions? And then what are some of the budget implications? And the idea is that gets infused into the strategic plan, the 5-year strategic plan, so that there's not a separate equity plan that the equity office works on, but this gets centralized in our day-to-day work and in our work plans, in our CIPs. And so the hope is you all will start to integrate that work and use it as a source document. And I think, Michelle, do you want to share a little bit about how that process goes and has gone over the last about 19 months? We've been working on the strategic plan and the equity plan.
Sure, thanks, Dr. Hawley. So the strategic plan, for those of you who are familiar with strategic plans, this is the board framework that the Board of Trustees adopted last summer. And you can see it includes mission, vision, a set of values that aren't represented here that are important, and then priority focus areas. There are 4 of them. Student well-being and achievement, teacher and employee well-being, culture of respect, customer service, fiscal stewardship, and prioritization. And the board felt very strongly that instead of having equity as a separate focus area, that it would be the foundation of the plan and woven throughout our district. And then after the board's framework was approved, to Dr. Hawley's point, if you go to the next slide, the board also approved a scorecard, which is how success will be measured against the plan. And then we have been working with Dr. Elizalde's leadership team on the strategies for making progress. And the equity action plan that Dr. Hawley's team has been working on has been a key source document for the strategic plan as we're developing strategies and then action steps. And if you, in the equity action plan, there are sets of recommendations that have essentially been crosswalked with the action steps for the strategic plan that we've been working on. So the administration develops the strategies, which are also the district improvement plan that you see here. And then that will ultimately be reflected in the campus improvement plans as that process moves forward through the summer and into the fall. Dr. Elizalde, okay.
Yeah, so just to answer the last part of the original question, you know, as we're refining the integration of the equity becoming an actual process in how we operate, I anticipate that we will have all of that will be available for review by the end of May. So at the very latest, all of that will be available by May 30. Is there 31 days in May? We'll get it out by the end of May. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So something that I've heard come up a handful of times during this conversation about equity is the importance of relationship building and getting to know our community. So I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Communications and Community Engagement Officer, Jason Stanford, to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we hope to be able to communicate better with our community and build those relationships.
Hi, thank you. One thing we're doing here at Austin ISD is adopting a newsroom model for our communications. It's not simply just going to be our voice and sending out bulletins into the community. We want to be reporting on how the community is interacting with us. For example, we're treating this, we're treating the subsequent version of this with the community members as a news event. And we're talking and we're letting the questions from the community drive the coverage so that we are speaking to the concerns of the community. Too often, I think a bureaucracy of any kind ends up talking about itself, and we want to be in conversation with the community. That is the intention here. We also want to, we're using the equity plan to inform how we're doing it, and we are moving towards featuring and listening and speaking with the voices that have usually been marginalized. That is a process that we are only on the beginning stages of. But we want to make sure that we are not just speaking to the loudest voices or to the ones who are fortunate enough to show up, but that we are seeking out, listening to, and in conversation with the people that usually aren't featured in communications from a school district.
Thank you so much. So with our last 15 minutes or so, I'd like to open up the floor to some of our leaders who we haven't heard from to highlight some of their priorities and achievements, starting with Ms. Elizabeth Casas to talk about academics.
Sure, thank you. So we have three major priorities. One is our special education department, which I'm sure you've heard we're doing a major reorganization and hiring a new leadership structure. We've heard loud and clear from our community that we need to improve those services for our students. And so we're taking that very seriously in how we reorg and restructure the department. The second one is our dual language program. We really want to make sure that we have fidelity to implementation so that we can make sure that our students are bilingual, biliterate, and graduate with the seal of biliteracy, so that they can go off and to the careers that they choose and having fluently 2 languages with academic language so they can be successful. And then the third one is the academics, making sure that we have rigorous instruction next year, understanding the challenges that our students are going to come to us with during all the COVID and taking that into consideration so that our curriculum is really built around accelerating instruction and not remediation. And then I would add the fourth one. I saw there were some questions about SEL and how we're going to support the schools. And part of one of the areas that we are restructuring on the academic side is merging of our SEL and our CP&I team, because you can't have a social and emotional learning environment without being culturally proficient. So there will be some cross training. And so instead of having 10 SEL specialists and 2 CP&I specialists, the team is growing to 13 with some cross training so that we can make sure that we are providing the tools and resources so that the schools have what they need to meet the needs of our students.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Casas. I know we're also anticipating some changes in the way that we do enrollment. So I'd like to open it up to Dr. Reach to talk a little bit about that. Do we have Dr. Reach? Maybe Dr. Elizalde?
So part of the challenges we've seen with enrollment are we can't expect our community to come to us. We have to go to our community. So there are a couple of things that we've put in the works. One is, of course, we did our first Operation Reconnect, led by the school leadership team, Dr. Mays, and we had, and several of you may have participated, we had community volunteers as well as staff. And we walked in some neighborhoods in some areas where we've lost some enrollment, and specifically to some of the neighboring charters. And so listening, which sometimes is hard to do, listening to some of the information our families need to share with us about why they've selected a different school, helps us to then respond in if there's a way in which we can respond, if what their concerns are, which some of the primary areas of concerns we heard happen to be around transportation. So there's some areas that we can make some adjustments. Some other things that we've also heard is the fact that sometimes possibly maybe not for this group per se, maybe there could be a few, but we've also heard from some other communities that the technology-based enrollment process is very challenging, especially for individuals who may not have access to that. So our principals came up with a great recommendation. Maybe we need to have the good old-fashioned paper and pencil type of enrollment processes, because we can be the ones that can put it into our electronic system and have parents be able to just fill out some forms, and we can still get all the information we need. And so that's another move that we're going to be making. So we need to really be responsive to understanding, like, some of these improvements do not cost us any money. They just cost us to think a little bit differently and to listen to our community. And where we can, we want to be able to do that. And so I think there's also an enrollment bus, if I recall, that Ms. Casas' team came up with. So we've got one of our pre-K buses that we outfitted with technology, not so the parent has to do it, but so they can step up with us and we can enroll a child right then and there. So we're looking at a variety of methods to both communicate programs. Another part of the strategic enrollment is to communicate with folks all of the programs we have. I have heard from some of our parents that say they wanted to know where dual language was. They were having to click on every single, even if they had access to technology, you have to go to every single school site to see, does that school offer dual language? So if we have a directory, which is something we're working on now, we will be able to have someone go through a directory both physically or online and be able to see where are all the dual language programs, where do they have, you know, a STEM focus, and where is there a fine arts focus. So parents would be able to see that in one-stop shop instead of having to navigate through so much. The more cumbersome our processes are, the more difficult it is, and the less, you know, user-friendly that we are. And it is about relationships, as many of you all have asked about. And so we'll continue to listen and think about ways in which we can expand our enrollment.
Thanks so much, Dr. Elizalde. Now I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Sean Brinkman, to talk a little bit about changes that are being made there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Apologize for being a little late. Your Chief Technology Officer, Sean Brinkman, having technology issues getting on. But one of the things I am excited about is we've really been trying to solve or continue to think about internet access to the home. You know, we've had this approach of providing students who don't have access a hotspot. There's some opportunities coming on down through the federal and state government to expand that approach to include fixed line internet, high-speed broadband access to students, as well as the opportunity for the district to kind of extend their Wi-Fi network out to the home, similar to what you're probably all familiar with. You put in a router. Whoever's in the household can access that the internet, and this would be filtered. So I'm really excited about trying to provide a sustainable solution so kids have access to high-speed internet in their home. We're working on that currently. Next year, we're also really going to put a focus on some of our business systems, in particular our ERP, our finance system, our HR systems. Right now, there is very little integration across all of the systems, and some of the things that you've talked about today. It's a very cumbersome manual process, and as we transition to a more modern business systems with better integrations, hopefully some of those processes become more efficient and easier for everyone. So those are the things we'll be focusing primarily on next year, as well as continue to support students with the one-to-one program and the instructional applications.
Fabulous, thank you so much. And last, I would like to turn it over to our Chief Operations Officer, Mr. Matias Segura, to talk a little bit about some of the facilities improvements and changes that are happening in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, a lot of really great, wonderful things. Certainly a lot of the folks on this call, including the LASA community, as well as the Rosedale community, have a lot of changes underway. You know, the move to the, what is the existing Eastside Memorial Campus is going to be a wonderful opportunity for the LASA community to grow. And we're very excited about that. That process, the move will begin July 26th and will end August 6th. You know, these things, there are a lot of folks working very, very hard to plan for a seamless move. Certainly, there will be bumps along the way, but we're very confident that the school will be ready to go the first day of school this coming school year. Certainly, a lot of wonderful modernization projects coming online. You can see here in the photographs that these modernized facilities certainly really improve the way our facilities support our students and staff, and we're very excited about continuing to meet the expectations of our voters and our community and delivering these on time and on budget. One of those that's currently under construction is Rosedale, such a wonderful facility that's currently under construction, and if you drive by, you'll be able to see it. It's just remarkable. So very excited about that. Additionally, you know, continuing to ensure that all of our students are warm, safe, and dry. Evaluating opportunities to improve HVAC systems, to improve security systems, identifying opportunities to improve how we transport students to campus, and just ensuring that everybody within the operations division understands that they have a very important role in the student's experience, and we're just excited to support that culture and take the next step together. So very excited and very much excited about seeing LASA move into the new home. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Segura. As we wrap up with the next couple of minutes here and maybe get some of these last questions answered, I would just like to remind everybody this session has been recorded. It will be uploaded hopefully soon. And if you have a question that you didn't think of during this call, you think of later, or didn't get answered, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Gabriella Becker. I just shared my email in the chat, and I'm happy to answer your question or connect you with someone who can. So with our last couple of minutes, do we have any final questions from anybody? You can type it in the chat or raise your hand. No? All right. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. Yes.
Before we close, I do want our audience, of course, to recognize that we want to thank all of our interpreters. We had our ASL and our Spanish interpreters. And of course, we want to thank you for also just guiding us through this process. I also want to make sure I shout out to all our principals who took time to be with us here with staff as well. I see Principal Dickey, I mentioned Principal Crescenzi, I see Chris Jones, I saw Tony Dishner. I'm trying to look at my Brady Brunch screen here. Who am I missing here? I'm looking for a principal that I may have missed. And I just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your afternoon to engage in these conversations. I know we don't always give all the answers. Trust me, we wish we could just say everything that everybody wants so that we could be like the most popular people in the world. We really want to do everything we can to continue to build on the success that is already here. And we want to work together so that we can continue to make sure that we meet the needs of you as our staff and as our community members. Every child, every day, from the community to the classroom. Thank you so very much for everything that you do for all of our students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elizalde, and to everybody for participating, to our interpreters, both ASL and Spanish, and to all of our staff members for being on this call. Hope you all have a good evening.